So back to Fukuyama, he says the authentic inner selves of Black Americans were not those of white people, but were shaped by the unique experiences of growing up Black in a hostile white society. This experience was defined by violence, racism, and denigration, and could not be appreciated by people who grew up differently. It could not be appreciated by people who grew up differently. These themes have been taken up in today's Black Lives Matter movement, which arose in the response to police violence in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, New York, and other American cities. This movement broadened over time from a demand for justice for individual victims, such as Michael Brown or Eric Gardner, to an effort to make people aware of the nature of day-to-day existence for Black Americans. Writers such as Ta-Nehisi Coates have connected contemporary police violence against African Americans to the long historical memory of slavery and lynching. This memory constitutes part of a gulf of understanding between Blacks and whites based on their different lived experiences. Okay, so Fukuyama is going to develop now here this notion of a gulf of understanding, or like a gulf of misunderstanding. That if you're a white American, you can't understand what it's like to be a Black American. And then what's at the root of that is this notion of lived experiences. To some degree, Fukuyama is going to distort authentic notions of identity politics, but again, Hayter explains it properly. So in a way, Hayter might be a better place to start. But I think Fukuyama is valuable because Fukuyama represents like mainstream thinking, or better, sort of the Washington consensus, what has been referred to as the blob. There's just this kind of groupthink that goes on in Washington, and I think the blob, the Washington consensus elites, that's actually who Fukuyama is writing this book for. And so that's this style that I was talking about. It's a little difficult to pin him down, and it's highly rhetorical, and the arguments are kind of sketchy. I think that's because his real audience is not a normal folk out in the demos, out amongst the people. His real audience is the Washington elites, the blob, and he wants to kind of rhetorically draw in the various factions of the Washington consensus and just kind of shape their perceptions in a rhetorical way to his view of the way that they should behave. Because again, I think he is an elitist, a Republican, traditional Republican elitist. He believes that the elite should manage the democracy, but he wants a different elite. He doesn't like the elite that's in control right now. He wants to get his own kind of elites into the Washington blob. So especially in this next section, Fukuyama is going to say some things about identity politics that is not quite correct, but it is the way that identity politics is perceived amongst the people in the blob, in the Washington consensus, and then that filters out, to newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's all part of the blob, and you have CNN and Fox and all those, but even more mainstream blobbish type media outlets like the PBS NewsHour. That's something that I watch quite regularly on the television. it filters into there where they're trying to be objective and unbiased, but there is a kind of inbuilt ideology that they're unaware of, and so Fukuyama is kind of expressing that ideology, and it's not clear to see how it's ideological because it's largely factually correct, but you'll see that Fukuyama's treatment is ideological again if you read the Hater text. So this is like the correction to Fukuyama's Washington consensus blobbishness. Okay, so and I think that's a good place to start. Let's start with the Washington consensus because that's what kind of permeates and sort of frames the discussion that you see in mainstream media. And then Hader's critiques make more sense because he's trying to undermine this ideology of the Washington consensus. Okay, so that's good. So in this section now, Fukuyama is going to talk about this gulf of understanding and lived experience. Okay. The same evolution occurred within the feminist movement, only more quickly and powerfully. The same evolution that happened in Black identity politics happened within the feminist movement, only more quickly and powerfully. The demands of the mainstream movement were focused, like the early civil rights movement, on equal treatment for women in employment, education, the courts, and so on. But from the beginning, an important strand of feminist thought argued that the consciousness and life experiences of women were fundamentally different from those of men, and that the movement's aim should not simply be to facilitate women's behaving and thinking like men. Simone de Beauvoir's highly influential 1949 book, The Second Sex, asserted that women's experience of life and their bodies was heavily shaped by the patriarchal nature of the society around them, and that this experience could be scarcely perceived by men. This view was expressed in more extreme form by feminist legal scholar Catherine MacKinnon, who argued that rape and intercourse were, quote, difficult to distinguish, and that existing laws on rape reflected the rapist's point of view. While not all of the writers of such laws were rapists, she said, they are a member of the group who do rape and who do for reasons that they share in common even with those who don't, namely masculinity and their identification with masculine norms. All right, so Fukuyama gives some good quotes there from MacKinnon. It's clear that she really is saying what he claims she is saying. This is kind of one of the ways I think that Fukuyama is rhetorically drawing in different factions of the Washington blob, because his use of MacKinnon here in tone suggests that there's something ridiculous about it, but he does not say that. And in fact, he agrees, I think, as far as I can tell, with what she's saying as being factually correct. So he's like playing both sides, and that's what's difficult about his style. But once you become aware of that style, just think about what he explicitly says and be very tuned into his tone, and think of him trying to shape the elite consensus in Washington, and do it in subtle ways so as maybe they don't quite notice what he's doing. Mm-hmm. All right, so the idea that each group has its own identity that was not accessible to outsiders was reflected in the use of the term lived experience, which has seen explosive growth in popular culture since the 1970s. The distinction between experience and lived experience has its roots in the difference between the German words Erfahrung and Erlebnis, which preoccupied a number of thinkers in the 19th century. Alfarong referred to experiences that could be shared as when people witness chemistry experiments in different laboratories. Leibniz, which incorporates the word Leben, or life, by contrast, meant the subjective perception of experiences, which might not necessarily be shareable. The writer, Walter Benjamin, argued in a 1939 essay, that modern life constituted a series of shock experiences that prevented individuals from seeing their lives as a whole and made it hard to convert Leibniz into Erfahrung, hard to convert lived experience into shareable experience, public experience. He saw this negatively as a new kind of barbarism in which communal memory breaks down into a series of individual experiences. This line of thought ultimately traces back, we should recall, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose emphasis on the sentiment of existence valorized subjective inner feeling over the shared norms and understandings of the surrounding society. Early in the book, Fukuyama develops this theme in Rousseau, the sentiment of existence, and correctly identifies that that's a thing out of Rousseau. It's a kind of inner feeling. There's some kind of inner feeling that is highly subjective, and society may not recognize that inner worth of your own subjective experience. And that's part of the problem that Rousseau sees with society, is trying to make individuals conform rather than expressing their personal experience. And so Jean-Jacques Rousseau emphasized the sentiment of existence, valorizing subjective inner feeling over shared norms and understandings of the surrounding society. The distinction between Erfahrung and Erlebnis is the same as the distinction between experience and lived experience. The latter term entered the English language via Simone de Beauvoir. The second volume of The Second Sex was entitled L'Expérience vécue, or lived experience. The lived experience of women was not the lived experience of men, she argued. Women's subjective experiences raised the profile of subjectivity as such, which was applied to other groups and categories. Those based on race, ethnicity, gender orientation, disability, and the like. Within each of these categories, lived experiences were different. Those of gays and lesbians different from those of transgender people. A black man in Baltimore has a different experience from a black woman in Birmingham, Alabama. The new prominence of lived experience reflects the broader nature of long-term modernization, one we noted earlier that gave rise to the problem of identity in the first place. Modernization entails the emergence of a complex society with an elaborate division of labor, the personal mobility that necessarily underlies modern market economies, and the movement from village to city that creates a diverse pluralism of individuals living next to one another. In contemporary societies, these social changes were deepened by modern communications technology and social media, which allow like-minded individuals in geographically separate places to communicate with one another. Okay? So there's this fragmenting of society with modernization. We're talking about like industrialization, people moving off the farm in rural villages and coming into the city to work in factories, where you're confronted with lots of different people from different cultural backgrounds, cultural diversity. Okay. So that experience of cultural diversity sort of breaks down the norms of some traditional notions of society And you get this fragmentation into identity groups that may be heightened by social media. And of course, that seems to be a big part of what's happening immediately right now in the last several years. In such a world, lived experiences and therefore identities begin to proliferate exponentially, just like YouTube stars and Facebook circles on the internet. What erodes just as rapidly is the possibility of old-fashioned experience. That is, perspectives and feelings that can be shared across group boundaries. The therapeutic turn that institutions such as schools, universities, health centers, and other social services had taken meant that they were ready to minister to people's psyches. The isothumia driving each social movement, as well as to their material conditions. As the growing consciousness of racial minorities and women became stronger in the 70s and 80s, a vocabulary and framework were ready-made for understanding their experiences of marginalization. Identity, which had formerly been a matter for individuals, now became the property of groups. Let me read that again. Identity, which had formerly been a matter for individuals, individual self-esteem, individual psychology, now became the property of groups that were seen as having their own cultures, shaped by their own lived experiences. So identity switches from individual identity to group identity. Again, this analysis does not seem exactly right. So look at Hayter, much better presentation of what identity politics is about. But Fukuyama is expressing the Washington Consensus.